Welcome back to another episode of Adoptions from the Heart TV. I'm your host, Amanda Aliberti. Today we're going to be sitting down with attorney Debbie Spivack, who's a Quad A adoption attorney. She's going to talk with social worker Danielle Goodman about the differences between private versus agency adoptions. Now let's turn to Danielle and Debbie.
Debbie, so I'm so glad that you are able to take the time to kind of just chat with me a little bit about the difference between private adoption, so families and birth parents working with attorneys, as well as, agency adoptions and kind of what the difference there is.
So it's a question that I get frequently. I think sometimes people come to adoption just having the experience of somebody they knew to go from. And I think from the very beginning, it's important to know that there's options and choices, which of course are different based on which state you live in. But overall, no matter which state you live in, I think that the two systems, private versus agency, have some very noteworthy differences.
Okay.
In a private adoption, birth parents, the parties, and adoptive parents come together through their own efforts.
Okay.
It could be that they advertised on the internet and met through a website. It could be that they met through a mutual friend who knew that there was a need on both sides and introduced them. It can come from many different places that are sometimes surprising. In contrast, in an agency placement, a birth parent has sought out an agency because they want to have counseling and services to understand what all of their rights are and what their options and choices are. So it's a voluntary process, and they come into the agency seeking those kinds of services. Sometimes they're already fairly sure, sometimes they're not, but having the agency structure gives them the opportunity to reflect on their decision, explore whether placement with family members or government resources could help them in making a different decision. And by the time they do get matched with adoptive parents, oftentimes they've had enough counseling that they have had time to reflect and are able to make a voluntary knowing decision.
Right.
I think the agency system also works well because the agency stays in that role. They remain as an intermediary between the parties on a neutral type of a basis and are able to provide counseling to both sides. And before they actually match clients with one another, they make sure there's a mutual fit. I have seen some cases on the private side where a birth parent might contact an adoptive parent and they get pretty far down in building the relationship before they realize they don't have the same goals for things like future contact.
Gotcha. Or
medical history might not be a match for one another. Perhaps there's a special need issue that hadn't come up before. And having an agency that collects background information from birth parents and also works with adoptive parents to formulate what fits with their personal family goals can be very helpful, because you don't have that issue come up later on when it's too far down the line.
when it's almost too late, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
When it can actually, frankly, be awkward and not the best choice for either client.
Right. I think that sometimes what I've heard, at least, is that they don't ask some of those hard questions when they're starting to meet privately or have those conversations. They don't maybe talk about that medical history. That's really, really important. And I do think that that's one really great thing that we do in an agency, is get that history prior to any connection, so that we can make sure that, those matches are correct and they're a good fit for everybody.
They are. I think sometimes with private adoption, the coming together can be a little bit more happenstance.
Right.
And usually as an attorney, I'll try to collect that information, prenatal records,
Gotcha.
Medical social history, on behalf of my client. But they're in a reactive mode where they have to make a decision after the fact as to whether this feels like a fit for them. Having the ability to be proactive and put your goals out there before having that introduction can be a very positive thing for both parties.
Okay. Anything else maybe about one versus the other that you want to kind of share?
Yes. Agency placements tend to be, I would say overall, slightly more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
There's usually a fixed bottom line within a range, depending, of course, on the state and whether there are certain types of legal issues or medical
Right.
Special needs, but within a range. You know what the button's going to be at the end.
Gotcha.
You know where you're going to be landing. And also in an agency placement, you don't, or you shouldn't pay the majority of that fee up front. I would say possibly a third of the fee can be due initially, but the bulk of the funds shouldn't be paid until the time of placement.
Gotcha.
And if something for some reason doesn't work out with that placement, at least you can, you're not going back to the drawing board. You're in that agency's pool and probably will have some degree of priority for another opportunity when it comes along. In a private adoption, overall, the potential for total fees and costs will be less in most cases. Because the matching wasn't something that was done through an agency, you used whatever those efforts were out of your own pocket or through your own networking. However, you're still going to want to make sure that both you and the birth parent have an advocate and have the ability to make fully informed voluntary decisions. And what happens is oftentimes adoptive parents have their own attorney, and the birth parent also has their own attorney at the adoptive parent's expense.
Gotcha.
And sometimes I serve in that role as the attorney for the birth parent, and I want to bring in a counselor because I don't have the experience, perhaps, on meeting her emotional needs or understanding as to why open adoption is something good for her. I can share my personal experiences and opinions, but when it comes to giving her the concrete details, oftentimes I'm limited to sending her some articles.
Gotcha.
And I think having somebody with the social work counseling training can be very advantageous for her. So these costs to the adoptive parents are going to be more on an a la carte basis.
Gotcha.
With the agency, there's soup to nuts. There's a lot that happens under the one umbrella. With the agency, you're going to be paying out of pocket, probably for 2 attorneys, and hopefully for a counselor as well. So overall, it can feel a little bit more painful because you'll be getting legal bills from the counselor, and you're not going to know until you get to the end whether it's going to be a successful adoption and whether those funds are going to be lost.
Gotcha.
Which hopefully they're not, but of course
Hopefully
it's
they're
always
not.
a possibility. So when the funds are expended in a private adoption, for the most part, those fees are lost upon payment.
Gotcha.
They're generally for services or costs as those things are delivered.
I understand. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Debbie, for kind of explaining things a little bit more private versus agency. We really do appreciate you taking the time this morning.
My pleasure.
To sit down. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Debbie and Danielle for explaining the differences between private versus agency adoption. As Debbie explained, having a backbone and a social worker to really be there to support both the adoptive family and the birth family is super important. Thanks so much, and tune in next week.